The bright studio lights of Morning Talk America cast harsh shadows across the pristine white set as Veronica Sterling adjusted her perfectly styled blonde hair and practiced her signature smile in the makeup mirror. At 38, she had built her television career on a carefully cultivated image of moral superiority and cultural commentary, using her daily talk show to position herself as a defender of traditional values against what she saw as the corrupting influences of modern entertainment. Veronica's show had gained significant ratings by featuring confrontational interviews with celebrities, politicians, and cultural figures whom she deemed problematic for American society. Her approach was always the same: extensive research into her guests' past controversies, carefully planned questions designed to create uncomfortable moments, and a presentation style that positioned her as the voice of concerned parents and upstanding citizens everywhere. Today's guest was particularly significant for her career aspirations. Ozzy Osbourne, the 75-year-old Prince of Darkness himself, was appearing to promote his new memoir and discuss his upcoming farewell tour. Veronica saw this interview as an opportunity to demonstrate her journalistic prowess by taking down one of rock music's most notorious figures, exposing what she believed would be his inability to defend decades of controversial behavior and questionable influence on young people. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could show your support with a like. Your encouragement means the world to writers like me and helps stories like this reach more readers. Her research team had spent weeks compiling a comprehensive file of Ozzy's most controversial moments from the 1970s through the early 2000s. The bat incident, various arrests, public intoxication episodes, and lyrics that religious groups had criticized as promoting violence or satanic themes. Veronica's plan was to systematically present these incidents as evidence of Ozzy's negative impact on society, forcing him to either defend the indefensible or admit that his career had been built on corrupting young minds. What Veronica didn't understand was that she was preparing to interview a man who had spent the last 20 years in recovery, who had raised 3 successful children, who had become one of entertainment's most enduring marriages, and who had evolved into something approaching an elder statesman of rock music. Her research focused entirely on his past controversies, while ignoring his personal growth, philanthropic work, and the wisdom that had come from surviving decades of challenges and mistakes. As Ozzy was escorted onto the set, wearing a simple black suit that managed to be both respectful for television and authentically his personal style, Veronica felt confident that her preparation would allow her to expose him as an aging relic whose influence had been harmful to society. She had no idea that she was about to encounter someone whose life experience and hard-won wisdom would completely derail her carefully planned attack. "Good morning, and welcome to Morning Talk America," Veronica began with her signature bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I'm Veronica Sterling, and today we're joined by John Osbourne, known professionally as Ozzy, who has spent over 5 decades as one of rock music's most controversial figures." The introduction was deliberately loaded, emphasizing controversy over achievement and framing the conversation around conflict rather than conversation. Ozzy simply nodded politely, recognizing the setup, but remaining calm and centered in the way that decades of sobriety and therapy had taught him to handle hostile situations. "Mr. Osbourne," Veronica continued, consulting her notes with theatrical precision, "you've built your career on shocking audiences and promoting behavior that many parents find deeply concerning. How do you justify the influence you've had on generations of young people?" The question was designed to put Ozzy immediately on the defensive, forcing him to either apologize for his entire career or appear callous about his impact on youth culture. But instead of responding with defensiveness or aggression, Ozzy paused thoughtfully and spoke with the kind of measured consideration that comes from years of reflection and personal growth. "That's an interesting way to frame my career," Ozzy replied, his Birmingham accent carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with Veronica's confrontational tone. "I'd say I've spent 5 decades being honest about human struggles, addiction, depression, feeling like an outsider, making mistakes, and trying to learn from them. If that's controversial, then I suppose controversy can sometimes be a form of truth-telling." Veronica's smile faltered slightly as she realized that Ozzy wasn't going to play defense in the way she'd anticipated. His response had reframed her attack as a conversation about authenticity and human experience, which wasn't the direction she wanted the interview to take. But surely you must acknowledge, she pressed on, that songs about darkness and rebellion have had negative effects on impressionable young minds. Do you take any responsibility for the troubled behavior of fans who may have been influenced by your music? I take responsibility for my own behavior, Ozzy answered calmly. And I've spent the last 20 years working very hard to understand the difference between artistic expression and personal choices. Music doesn't make people do things. It helps them understand feelings they're already having. If a young person is struggling with depression or feeling alienated, they're not going to become depressed because they heard one of my songs. They're going to feel less alone because someone else has expressed what they're experiencing. The response was so thoughtful and articulate that Veronica found herself momentarily off balance. She had expected either angry defensiveness or uncomfortable silence, not a nuanced discussion of art's role in emotional processing and mental health support. But what about the incident in 1982 when you bit the head off a bat during a concert? Veronica asked, clearly hoping to shift the conversation towards sensationalism and shock value. Wasn't that exactly the kind of destructive behavior that sets a terrible example for young people? Ozzy chuckled softly, a sound that suggested genuine amusement rather than defensiveness. You know, that incident happened 41 years ago when I was struggling with severe alcoholism and making very poor decisions about almost everything in my life. Someone threw what I thought was a rubber bat onto the stage, and in my impaired state, I made a stupid choice that I immediately regretted. He paused, looking directly at Veronica with an expression that was both serious and compassionate. But here's what I find interesting about that question. You're asking me about something that happened over 4 decades ago, as if that moment defines everything I've done since then. In the last 20 years, I've been sober. I've raised 3 children who are successful and contributing members of society, and I've used my platform to support addiction recovery programs and mental health awareness initiatives. So you're saying that your past behavior doesn't matter? Veronica asked, sensing that her original strategy wasn't working but unsure how to adapt to Ozzy's thoughtful responses. I'm saying that growth and redemption matter, Ozzy replied with quiet conviction. I'm saying that people are capable of learning from their mistakes and becoming better versions of themselves. And I'm wondering why you seem more interested in discussing who I was 40 years ago than who I am today. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time in the interview, Veronica looked genuinely uncomfortable. Her entire approach was based on using people's past mistakes to embarrass them in the present, and Ozzy had just called attention to the fundamental cruelty of that methodology. Well, certainly people can change, Veronica said, trying to regain control of the conversation. But don't you think that public figures have a special responsibility to set good examples from the beginning of their careers? Absolutely, Ozzy agreed immediately. And I think that includes the responsibility to be honest about struggles, to show that recovery is possible, and to demonstrate that people can overcome circumstances that seem hopeless. If I had started my career pretending to be perfect, I couldn't have helped the thousands of people who have told me that my music got them through addiction, depression, or other mental health challenges. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. You know what I find troubling about this line of questioning? You seem to believe that the most important thing a public figure can do is avoid making mistakes, rather than learning from them and helping others learn from them too. Veronica realized that she was losing control of the interview entirely. Instead of exposing Ozzy as a corrupting influence, she was inadvertently providing him with a platform to discuss personal growth, recovery, and social responsibility in ways that made her look shallow and punitive by comparison. But surely you must admit, she tried again, that heavy metal music in general promotes violence and antisocial behavior among young people. Have you ever actually listened to heavy metal music? Ozzy asked with genuine curiosity. Or studied its lyrical content and the communities that form around it? Veronica's pause before answering revealed that her opinions were based on assumptions rather than investigation. Well, I've read about the concerning themes and violent imagery. I see, Ozzy said with a slight smile that suggested he understood exactly what kind of research she'd done. So you're making judgments about an entire musical genre and its impact on millions of people based on second-hand reports, rather than direct experience or scholarly research. He turned to address the camera directly, speaking to the viewing audience rather than to Veronica. Heavy metal music has actually been studied extensively by psychologists and sociologists. Research consistently shows that it helps people process difficult emotions in healthy ways, creates supportive communities for people who feel like outsiders, and provides emotional release that reduces rather than increases aggressive behavior. Turning back to Veronica, he continued, but more importantly, the heavy metal community has raised millions of dollars for charity, supported addiction recovery programs, and created spaces where people who feel different or misunderstood can find acceptance and belonging. If you're genuinely concerned about young people's well-being, those seem like positive outcomes worth celebrating. Veronica was now visibly struggling, her carefully planned attack having been systematically dismantled by someone who was better informed, more thoughtful, and more articulate than she had anticipated. In desperation, she decided to make her approach more personal and direct. "Mr. Osbourne, don't you think that someone with your history of drug abuse and erratic behavior is really qualified to be giving advice or serving as any kind of role model?" The question was mean-spirited and personal in a way that went beyond legitimate journalism into cruelty. But instead of responding with anger or defensiveness, Ozzy looked at Veronica with something approaching pity. "I think," he said slowly, "that someone who has experienced the worst consequences of addiction and has worked hard to achieve lasting recovery might actually be uniquely qualified to help others who are struggling with similar challenges. I think that someone who has made serious mistakes and learned from them might have more to offer than someone who has never faced real adversity." He paused, studying Veronica's face with the kind of attention typically reserved for important decisions. "But I'm curious about something. This entire interview has been focused on trying to embarrass me or make me appear to be a bad influence. You've ignored my recovery, my family, my charitable work, and my positive impact on people's lives. Why do you think that is?" "I'm simply asking the tough questions that our viewers deserve to have answered," Veronica replied defensively. "No," Ozzy said with quiet certainty. "You're trying to create conflict and controversy for entertainment value, and you're doing it by attacking someone's character based on mistakes they made decades ago. That's not journalism. That's public cruelty disguised as moral concern." The studio fell completely silent as the weight of Ozzy's observations settled over everyone present. Crew members, producers, and even the floor manager were staring at Veronica with expressions that ranged from surprise to disappointment. "What I find most troubling," Ozzy continued, his voice remaining calm but gaining intensity, "is that you're using your platform to promote shame and judgment rather than understanding and growth. You're suggesting that people can't change, that mistakes define us forever, and that public figures should be perfect rather than human." He looked directly into the camera again, speaking to the audience with the authority of someone who had earned the right to discuss these topics through lived experience. "To anyone watching who is struggling with addiction, mental health issues, or feeling like they've made mistakes that can't be forgiven, don't let anyone tell you that you can't change, grow, and become the person you want to be. Recovery is possible, growth is possible, and your past doesn't have to determine your future." Turning back to Veronica, he delivered his final observation with devastating clarity. "And to journalists and media personalities who think their job is to tear people down rather than inform the public, you're part of the problem, not the solution. You're contributing to a culture of shame and judgment that prevents people from seeking help when they need it most." The interview ended abruptly, with Veronica clearly unable to continue the conversation in any meaningful way. But the damage to her reputation and career was just beginning. Within hours of the broadcast, social media was flooded with clips from the interview, but not in the way Veronica had hoped. Instead of viral moments of Ozzy being embarrassed or exposed, the clips showed him demonstrating wisdom, compassion, and articulate intelligence while Veronica appeared increasingly small-minded and cruel. The hashtag #VeronicaSterlingExposed began trending as viewers shared their own stories of recovery, personal growth, and transformation, all inspired by Ozzy's defense of second chances and human potential. Mental health advocates praised his responses, addiction recovery specialists cited his comments in their own work, and even mainstream media critics began questioning the ethics of Veronica's interview style. More damaging to Veronica's career, was the broader conversation that emerged about the responsibility of media personalities to promote understanding rather than division. Journalism schools began using the interview as an example of how not to conduct meaningful conversations with public figures, while media ethics experts wrote extensively about the difference between legitimate tough questions and performative cruelty. Advertisers began pulling their support from Morning Talk America as they realized that association with Veronica's approach to interviewing was damaging their brands. The show's ratings initially spiked due to curiosity about the controversial interview, but then plummeted as viewers expressed disgust with what they saw as bullying disguised as journalism. Within 6 months, Veronica Sterling was fired from her show, with network executives citing creative differences, but privately acknowledging that her approach had become a liability that they could no longer defend. Her attempts to find work at other networks were unsuccessful, as her reputation for hostile interviews had made her toxic within the industry. Meanwhile, Ozzy's thoughtful and compassionate responses during the interview led to opportunities to speak about addiction recovery and mental health awareness at universities, medical conferences, and policy forums. His ability to articulate complex ideas about personal growth and social responsibility earned him respect in academic and professional circles that had previously dismissed him as merely an entertainer. The interview became a case study in communication programs, demonstrating how authenticity, preparation, and genuine wisdom could triumph over planned attacks and superficial judgments. It showed that attempting to humiliate someone often revealed more about the attacker's character than their target's vulnerabilities. For Veronica, the interview became a cautionary tale about the dangers of building a career on tearing others down rather than creating meaningful content. Her fall from television prominence was swift and complete, serving as a reminder that audiences ultimately preferred authentic conversation over manufactured controversy. But perhaps the most important outcome of the interview was its impact on public discourse about recovery, second chances, and the possibility of personal transformation. Ozzy's defense of these principles, delivered with eloquence and conviction, inspired countless individuals to seek help for their own struggles or to reconsider their judgments about others who had made mistakes. The interview demonstrated that wisdom often emerged from experience rather than education, that authentic authority came from surviving challenges rather than avoiding them, and that the most powerful responses to attack were often those that elevated the conversation rather than descending to the attacker's level. Years later, the interview was still referenced in discussions about media ethics, the responsibility of public figures, and the importance of allowing people to grow beyond their past mistakes. It had become a defining moment, not just for both participants, but for broader conversations about redemption, judgment, and the possibility of positive change in human behavior. Most importantly, it proved that attempting to destroy someone's reputation often revealed the moral bankruptcy of the attacker, while simultaneously providing the target with an opportunity to demonstrate their true character and values. In trying to humiliate Ozzy Osbourne, Veronica Sterling had instead created a platform for him to share wisdom that would influence thousands of people struggling with their own challenges and seeking their own paths to recovery and growth. Thank you for reading this powerful story about wisdom triumphing over malice and the importance of second chances. If this tale of how authentic character can overcome calculated attacks resonated with you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you could show your support with a like. Your engagement helps stories like this reach more readers and reminds us all that true strength often comes from vulnerability, growth, and the courage to defend what's right.